The vampire king's son had been deaf since birth until a castle maid reached into his ear and pulled out a black crystal no bigger than a seed. The boy gasped, hearing his own heartbeat for the first time. What no one knew, the crystal had been placed there 17 years ago by the same council, now demanding her execution for touching royal blood. The stone corridors of the East Wing were silent, except for the whisper of Mira's worn boots against cold flagstone, each step echoing softly in the pre-dawn darkness that clung to the vampire king's private residence like a shroud. Blue witchlight flickered in iron sconces bolted to walls older than memory, casting shadows that danced and twisted as she passed, her cleaning bucket heavy in one hand and a bundle of rags tucked under her arm. The air smelled of old parchment and iron, that peculiar metallic scent that seemed to seep from the very bones of the palace, a reminder that this place belonged to creatures who drank blood and walked in darkness. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Mira had been a servant here for 5 years, ever since she arrived with nothing but the clothes on her back and ash still clinging to her hair from the village that burned behind her, though she never spoke of that night or the witch hunters who came with torches and accusations that had nothing to do with truth. The palace paid well and asked few questions, which made it the perfect place for someone who needed to disappear, to become invisible among the hundreds of servants who scrubbed floors and changed linens and pretended not to notice when nobles fed from willing donors in shadowed alcoves. She had requested the night rotation in the East Wing specifically because most servants avoided it, terrified of disturbing the royal family or drawing the attention of ancient vampires whose moods could shift like quicksilver. But Mira found safety in solitude and the rhythmic work of cleaning rooms where power lived and breathed. She paused outside the prince's chambers, adjusting her grip on the bucket, before pushing open the heavy oak door, moving quietly out of long habit, though she knew he would not hear her enter. Prince Adrian sat in his usual place by the window, moonlight spilling over his shoulders and illuminating the book in his lap, his dark hair falling across his forehead as he read with the intense focus of someone for whom the written word was the only reliable form of communication. He was 17, poised on the edge of adulthood, with the sharp, elegant features of his father and a stillness about him that came from living in perpetual silence. Mira had been cleaning his room for 2 years, and they had never spoken, not truly, though sometimes she caught him watching her with those pale gray eyes that seemed to see more than most people realized. He read lips with practiced skill, but rarely engaged with servants, maintaining a careful distance that she understood was part pride and part self-protection. The armor of a prince who had learned early that his disability made him vulnerable in a court that valued power above all else. She moved through the room with efficient grace, dusting the desk where he built intricate model ships from wood and wire, emptying the cold fireplace, straightening the books stacked on every available surface. It was while reaching for a leather-bound volume on military history that she noticed his hand move to his left ear, fingers pressing against the side of his head as his face tightened in a brief grimace of pain. He lowered his hand quickly, returning his attention to his book, but Mira had seen that gesture before in her younger brother, who suffered frequent ear infections before the fever took him. She hesitated, cloth still in hand, knowing she was about to cross a line that servants did not cross. But something in the rigid set of Adrian's shoulders and the way he kept touching his ear made her set down her supplies and step closer. She moved into his line of sight and carefully formed the hand signs she had learned from the deaf baker who worked in the palace kitchens, asking with simple gestures if she could look, if he was in pain, if he would permit her to help. Adrian's eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering across features trained to reveal nothing, and for a long moment he simply stared at her as if trying to determine whether this was some kind of test or trap. Then, slowly, he nodded and turned his head to give her access to his left ear. Mira retrieved the small tweezers he used for his model ships and a clean cloth. her hands steady despite the voice in her head screaming that touching a member of the royal family without explicit permission was punishable by death. She tilted his head gently toward the moonlight, peering into his ear canal and expecting to find impacted wax, or perhaps a small infection, something simple that would explain his discomfort. Instead, her fingers closed on something that should not have been there, something hard and cold that seemed to pulse with a faint vibration like a heartbeat trapped in stone. She worked carefully, holding her breath as she maneuvered the object toward the opening, feeling Adrian go very still beneath her touch. The black crystal seed emerged slowly, no bigger than a peppercorn, but etched with silver runes that caught the moonlight and threw it back in strange patterns. And the moment it left his ear canal, everything changed. Adrian gasped, a raw sound torn from a throat unused to making noise, and his hands flew to the sides of his head as if trying to block out an overwhelming assault. The room flooded with sound that Mira had long since learned to tune out, but that must have crashed over him like a physical wave. The crackling of embers in the fireplace across the hall, the distant toll of bells marking the hour, the thunderous rhythm of his own heartbeat suddenly audible for the first time in his life. He clutched the edge of his desk, knuckles white, breathing hard as his eyes darted around the room, trying to match sounds to their sources, his face a mixture of wonder and terror and confusion so profound it hurt to witness. He looked at Mira and his lips moved, forming words that emerged as barely more than a whisper, but that carried the weight of a miracle. "I can hear you," he said, his voice rough and unpracticed, the voice of someone speaking aloud for the first time. Then his expression shifted to something harder, more guarded, and he asked in that same raw whisper what she had done, what she had taken from his ear, why he could suddenly hear the world that had been silent since before memory. Before Mira could answer, before she could even begin to formulate an explanation for something she did not understand herself, the door to his chambers slammed open with enough force to crack against the stone wall. Two royal guards stood in the doorway, their hands already moving to the swords at their hips, their faces grim with the particular expression of men who had been trained to see threats in everything. They took in the scene with practiced efficiency, a low-born maid standing over the prince, holding an unknown object in her hand, while the prince himself sat gasping and clutching his desk, visibly distressed, and Mira knew with terrible certainty that what they saw bore no resemblance to what had actually occurred. One guard's hand closed fully on his sword hilt, the rasp of metal on leather loud in the sudden silence, while the other moved toward her with the controlled violence of a predator closing on prey. She tried to speak, to explain, but the words died in her throat as iron manacles closed around her wrists and the black crystal was torn from her grasp. Adrian was shouting something, his new voice cracking with the effort, but the guards were already dragging her from the room, their grip bruising as they hauled her through corridors that had felt safe just moments before. The holding cell beneath the throne hall was exactly what she expected, stone walls slick with moisture, and a smell of old fear that had seeped into the very rock over centuries of use. They threw her inside without ceremony, and the door clanged shut with a finality that made her stomach drop. The sound of iron meeting iron in the perfect closure of a trap. She had no way to know the time, except by the slow creep of cold up from the stone floor. But later she would learn it was 4:47 in the morning when her life changed irrevocably. Adrian tried to follow when the guards took Mira away, his legs unsteady and his hands still pressed to his ears, as if he could somehow control the flood of sensation pouring through newly opened channels. Every sound was too loud, too sharp, each footstep like thunder, and each voice like knives scraping against the inside of his skull, and he stumbled in the hallway outside his chambers while trying to demand they release her, trying to make them understand that she had helped him, healed him, given him something he had never dared hope to possess. Captain Thorne appeared from somewhere, his weathered face creased with concern, but also with the implacable determination of a man who served the council first, and the royal family second, and his hand on Adrian's shoulder was gentle but firm as he steered the prince away from the cells and toward the king's private study. "The vampire king must be informed, Your Highness," Thorn said, his lips moving in patterns Adrian could now match to the words he heard for the first time, and there was something in the captain's expression that suggested this was not simply about protocol, but about something far more dangerous. King Lucian Draven sat at his desk reviewing border treaties when his son burst through the door without knocking, and for a moment the ancient vampire simply stared at the boy who had always moved through life with careful silence. Lucian was tall and controlled in the way of creatures who had lived long enough to master every outward expression, his silver-black hair pulled back from a face that could have been 40 but was actually 8 centuries old, eyes the color of smoke watching Adrian with an intensity that could pin a man to the wall. He had ruled the Nocturne Court alone since his queen died, bringing Adrian into the world. 17 years of solitary power, broken only by this silent son whom he loved but had never quite known how to reach. He had learned sign language, hired the best tutors, ensured Adrian had every advantage, but there had always been a wall between them, an unbridgeable gap created by the silence that defined his son's existence. "Father, I can hear," Adrian said, and his voice was strange and rough, but unmistakably real, unmistakably speaking aloud instead of signing, and Lucian froze with his quill suspended over parchment. The shaft snapped between his fingers, ink spattering across treaties that would now need to be rewritten, but he did not seem to notice, as genuine emotion cracked through the mask he had worn for decades. Hope flickered in his eyes along with disbelief and fear, a complex storm of feelings that transformed his face into something almost human. And his question was barely a whisper as he asked how this was possible, how his son could suddenly possess what had been absent since birth. Captain Thorn entered then, his timing too perfect to be coincidence, carrying a small glass vial that held the black crystal seed Mira had extracted. Lucian's face drained of what little color it held, an impressive feat for a vampire, and Adrian watched his father's expression shift from wonder to recognition to something that looked uncomfortably like horror. The king said nothing for a long moment, simply staring at the crystal as if it were a serpent coiled to strike. And when he finally asked who had removed it, his voice was carefully controlled in a way that made Adrian's newly functioning ears pick up the danger beneath the calm. When Thorn explained that a low-born maid had performed the extraction, Lucian's expression hardened into something cold and terrible, and he spoke 2 words that made Adrian's blood run cold, despite his inability to fully understand their implications. "Summon the High Council," the Vampire King said, and his tone allowed for no argument or delay. Dawn was breaking over the palace when the High Council convened, pale sunlight filtering through stained glass windows in shades of crimson and violet, though the vampires of noble blood tolerated indirect sunlight well enough, and purebloods like Lucian were entirely immune to its effects. 5 ancient vampires arrived in black robes with silver chains of office gleaming at their throats, each one a power in their own right, each one accustomed to advising and often controlling the throne through the complex web of laws and traditions that bound even kings. Counselor Vex moved with the cold precision of a master of law, his face sharp and calculating as he took his seat at the curved table. Counselor Isabeau followed, obsessed with bloodline purity and the maintenance of vampire superiority, her eyes like chips of ice. Counselor Mordain bore the scars of countless battles, pragmatic and direct in the way of career soldiers. Counselor Seraph served as chief mage and keeper of secrets, her age impossible to determine, and her power palpable even in the way she moved. Counselor Elara appeared kind with soft features and a gentle smile, which made her the most dangerous of all because people consistently underestimated the diplomat until her knives were already buried in their backs. They arranged themselves with practiced efficiency, while Lucian stood at the head of the table, and Adrian was positioned to one side, still reeling from the sensory overload of a world that would not stop making noise. Vex opened a leather-bound volume and read the charges in a voice devoid of inflection. "The human servant Mira Ashton has violated Sacred Law 13, which states that no common-born may touch royal blood without explicit summons or consent, and the penalty for such violation is execution by dawn's light." Adrian jerked forward, his protest loud and uncontrolled as he shouted that she had healed him, given him his hearing, saved him from something he had not even known he was suffering. But Counselor Seraph raised one pale hand for silence. She gestured for the glass vial and examined the black crystal with narrowed eyes, holding it up to the light, where the silver runes seemed to writhe and shift. "This is silencing root," she said, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of study, ancient blood magic that does not heal but suppresses, and someone placed this in the prince's ear 17 years ago, shortly after his birth. The room went silent in a way that had nothing to do with Adrian's former deafness, and everything to do with the implications of what had just been said. Lucian's voice dropped to a lethal whisper as he asked who had access to his infant son, who could have placed such a curse, who had stolen 17 years of sound from his child, and the question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Isabeau deflected with practiced ease, suggesting that investigation would take time and resources, but that regardless of the crystal's origins, the law was clear. The girl had touched the prince without permission and must die before sunset, or they risked blessing breach, the dissolution of the sacred protections that kept the vampire court stable. Adrian looked at his father, silently begging him to intervene, to use his power as king to save the woman who had given him the world. But he saw the conflict in Lucian's eyes and understood with sick certainty that this was not a simple matter of royal decree. The council held the right of accord, an ancient pact that bound even kings to certain laws and traditions. And if Lucian broke it unilaterally, the noble houses could fracture into civil war, turning vampire against vampire in a bloodbath that would destroy everything he had worked centuries to build. The vampire king met his son's eyes, and Adrian saw the pain there, the impossible choice being made in real time. And when Lucian spoke, his voice was steady, but his hands were clenched into fists. "The girl will be tried at sunset," he said. "Until then she is held under the throne." And the words fell like stones into deep water, ripples spreading outward to touch everything they had built. The council began to disperse, their robes whispering against stone as they filed out to attend to their various duties. But Seraph lingered after the others had gone. She approached Lucian with something concealed in her hand, moving close enough that Adrian could not quite see what passed between them, and when she withdrew, Lucian stood staring at a scrap of parchment that trembled slightly in his grip. Adrian caught only a glimpse of the writing before his father closed his fist around the paper. But what he saw made his newly restored hearing seem suddenly insignificant. A single line written in elegant script that he somehow knew belonged to the mother he had never really known, the queen who died so he could live. "If the silence breaks," the note read, "do not trust the five." And those 7 words contained multitudes of meaning that Adrian could not yet parse, but that transformed his father's face into a mask of barely controlled rage and grief, and something that looked uncomfortably like fear. Mira's cell was a narrow chamber carved from stone that wept moisture down walls blackened by centuries of misery. Iron bars thick as a man's wrist separating her from freedom, while witchlight burned overhead with a pale blue glow that never dimmed or flickered, denying her even the mercy of darkness. There were no windows to mark the passage of time, no sounds except the distant drip of water somewhere in the depths and the irregular tread of guards changing shifts. But she had counted heartbeats and breaths until she estimated it was 9:15 in the morning, which meant she had 9 hours until sunset brought her death. She sat on the stone bench that served as her only furniture and forced herself to think past the fear that threatened to swallow her whole, reviewing what she knew with the methodical precision of someone who had survived by noticing details others missed. The crystal had been inside Prince Adrian's ear for 17 years, which meant it was placed there when he was an infant, too young to remember or resist, and the question that burned brightest in her mind was who would curse a royal child, and why the council demanded her death with such urgency, unless someone feared what she knew or had seen. She had seen only a black crystal seed etched with silver runes, had felt it pulse with strange energy in her fingers, but perhaps that was enough to make her dangerous to whoever had placed it there all those years ago. someone powerful enough to access the royal nursery and cruel enough to steal a child's hearing for purposes Mira could not yet fathom. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor and she tensed, expecting guards or perhaps Counselor Vex come to gloat over her impending execution, but instead a familiar figure emerged from the shadows, moving with the uncertain gait of someone still learning to trust his newly restored senses. Prince Adrian approached the bars of her cell alone, which was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish, given that speaking to her could be construed as defying the council's judgment, and when he met her eyes, she saw guilt written clearly across his face. He had come through the servant passages, he explained in that rough, unused voice. One of the few advantages of being ignored his whole life was learning the castle's hidden routes and forgotten corridors. But he could not free her because guards rotated every hour, and the cell was warded against magical interference. Mira pushed herself to standing and moved closer to the bars, close enough to see that his eyes were red-rimmed and his hands shook slightly with the effort of processing a world that would not stop assaulting his ears. He apologized then, the word heavy with genuine remorse, but Mira cut him off with a shake of her head and told him plainly that she would do it again, would choose to help him again, even knowing the consequences, because some things mattered more than survival. Adrian explained the council and their power, the ancient laws that bound even kings, the complex politics that made her death seem inevitable, and Mira listened with growing anger at the injustice of it all, before asking why he let them control him, why he accepted their authority when he was royal blood and they were merely advisors. His laugh was bitter and sharp, a sound he had never made before that day, and he told her that he had been deaf, broken in their eyes. A king who could not hear his people was no king at all, but merely a symbol to be paraded when convenient, and ignored when decisions needed to be made. He had never been meant to rule, he said. The council had made that clear from his earliest memories, and his father's love had not been enough to overcome the cold calculus of power that governed the nocturne court. Mira asked if he remembered anything from before he lost his hearing, grasping for clues that might explain the crystal's purpose, and Adrian closed his eyes with an expression of intense concentration. He had been too young for clear memories, he said, but his nurse once mentioned that he used to laugh at music boxes, would gurgle and wave his tiny fists when the mechanisms played their tinkling songs. And then one morning, he woke up silent, and the physicians declared it a birth defect that had surfaced late, though his father never spoke of it afterward. Mira pressed for more details, and Adrian revealed almost casually that his mother died the same night he went silent. Another tragedy in a household already drowning in grief. And Mira filed this information away with growing certainty that the two events were connected. After Adrian left through the same hidden passage, moving carefully to avoid the guards who walked their rounds with mechanical precision, Mira sat in silence for perhaps an hour before another visitor approached her cell. This figure was hooded and limping badly. An elderly man who moved with the careful steps of someone whose body had betrayed him long ago, and when he pushed back his hood, she saw a face lined with age and eyes that held the faint red gleam of vampire blood diluted by human ancestry. He introduced himself as Elias, the palace archivist, a half-vampire whose mixed bloodline granted him extended life but weaker powers than his pure-blooded cousins, and he slid a leather journal through the bars with trembling hands. Her predecessor left this, he said in a voice rough with emotion. She was executed 12 years ago for theft, but she was not a thief. She was a witness to something the council wanted buried. The journal was bound in cracked leather and filled with cramped handwriting that spoke of fear and desperation. Its author, a maid named Celeste, who had worked in the East Wing just as Mira did now. Mira opened it carefully and read entries that described strange midnight meetings, counselors visiting the infant prince's nursery when they had no official reason to be there, whispered conversations about a ritual of protection that required a seed of silence to be placed where it would do its work unseen. The entries grew more frantic toward the end, as Celeste realized she had seen too much, knew too much, and the final words were scrawled in handwriting that shook across the page. They saw me watching, and they are coming for me tonight. Mira looked up at Elias and asked why he had kept this journal hidden for 12 years, why he risked bringing it to her now, and the old archivist's smile was sad and knowing. "Because Celeste was my daughter," he said, "and I have waited a dozen years for someone brave enough or foolish enough to finish what she started, to expose the truth she died protecting." In another part of the castle, King Lucian retreated to the royal vault, a chamber beneath the throne room sealed by blood magic that recognized only his touch. The door opened at his approach, ancient mechanisms grinding as stone slid against stone, and he descended stairs worn smooth by centuries of use into a space that smelled of dust and old sorrow. Here he kept his late wife's belongings, the artifacts of a love that had burned bright and brief before being extinguished by forces he had not fully understood until this moment. Queen Isolde had been human when he married her, a scandal that sent shockwaves through the vampire nobility who believed bloodline purity was sacred law. But Lucian had loved her with an intensity that made politics seem insignificant. She had been turned to vampire to survive the difficult birth that brought Adrian into the world, but the transformation went wrong in ways the physicians could not explain, her body rejecting the change even as it saved her life. She lived 3 days after Adrian's birth, long enough to hold her son once and whisper something to Lucian that he had dismissed as delirium born of fever and pain. "They will take his voice if we are not careful," she had said, her hand gripping his with desperate strength. "Protect him from the silence that comes from within." Lucian opened the trunk that held her personal effects and found what he sought, a bundle of letters tied with ribbon that had once been white but had yellowed with age. Isolde had corresponded with a witch ally, he discovered, someone she trusted enough to confess her fears about the council's plotting against their union. The letters spoke of human-born queens diluting the sacred bloodline, of whispers in dark corridors about regency and control, and Isolde had asked her friend for a ward of protection for Adrian, something to shield him from the machinations she felt closing in around their family. The witch's response was careful and specific, warning that if the council moved first, they would use silence as their weapon, robbing Adrian of the ability to hear and speak, and thus rendering him unfit to rule in the eyes of vampire law. Counter-magic requires consent from both parents, the witch had written, and must be placed before the curse takes hold. But Isolde never got the chance to act on this advice. Lucian realized with terrible clarity that his wife had been right, that someone on the council had placed the silencing route not to harm Adrian, but to make him ineligible for the throne, ensuring that power remained with the 5 ancient vampires who advised kings, but preferred to rule through puppets and regents. He could not prove which counselor had done it without triggering the civil war that would tear the Nocturne court apart, noble houses turning on each other in a bloodbath that would destroy everything he had built over 8 centuries of careful rule. But he could buy time, could delay the execution long enough to gather evidence or force the guilty party into revealing themselves through action or inaction. He summoned Captain Thorne, one of the few people in the palace he trusted completely, and gave orders that the maid's execution be delayed on grounds that she must first be interrogated by the chief mage to determine if she was part of a larger conspiracy. "Seraph will cooperate," Lucian said with confidence born of having read his wife's final letter, the one that warned him not to trust the 5, but that Seraph herself had delivered, a paradox that suggested the chief mage was playing a deeper game than the others realized. The council's response was immediate and furious, Vex and Isabeau arriving within the hour with expressions of barely controlled rage at this deviation from established law. "The law is absolute, Majesty," Vex said in his cold, precise voice, "and cannot be altered for sentiment or personal preference." But Lucian met his gaze with the full weight of 800 years of authority. "The law also grants me the right to investigate treason," he replied. "And if this maid was an assassin or part of a conspiracy to harm the royal family, we need to know who sent her and what their ultimate goal might be." Vex's jaw tightened, and something flickered in his eyes that might have been fear or calculation. But he could not argue the point without revealing knowledge he should not possess, and so the council was forced to accept the delay, though their displeasure was palpable. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, with 5 hours remaining until sunset, Mira was brought from her cell to the mage's tower for interrogation. The guards who escorted her were not gentle, but neither were they cruel. Simply efficient as they climbed spiral stairs that seemed to go on forever, emerging finally in a circular room whose walls were lined with floating crystals that pulsed with soft light. Counselor Seraph waited for her, ancient and inscrutable, her age impossible to determine, and her power evident in the way reality seemed to bend slightly around her presence. She dismissed the guards with a gesture, and they retreated, closing the door but remaining just outside, close enough to intervene if the prisoner tried anything foolish. Seraph placed the black crystal seed on a silver dish and commanded Mira to touch it again, to recreate the moment of extraction, and Mira hesitated because touching that thing once had nearly gotten her killed. But she saw something in the chief mage's eyes that suggested this was a test of more than magical compatibility, and so she reached out and pressed her fingertip to the crystal's surface. The seed hummed with sudden energy, and silver runes flared to brilliant life, writing themselves in the air around Mira's hand, in patterns she could not read, but that made Seraph's eyes widen with something that looked like recognition or vindication. "You have latent magic," the chief mage said, "untrained and probably unconscious, but present nonetheless, which is why you could remove the curse when others could not. It was keyed to resist anyone with hostile intent, but you acted out of compassion, and so it did not recognize you as a threat." Mira pulled her hand back as if burned and insisted that she was not a witch, was human and nothing more. But Seraph shook her head with the patience of someone who had seen this particular denial countless times. "Magic does not care what you call yourself," she said. "Your bloodline carries something old that has probably been dormant for generations, sleeping until circumstances awakened it, and those circumstances have now made you extraordinarily dangerous to certain parties who prefer their secrets buried." The real revelation came when Seraph leaned closer and spoke in a voice too low for the guards outside to hear, telling Mira that the council would kill her regardless of evidence or testimony because she represented a threat to their long-term plans. "But if you survive the next 2 hours," the chief mage continued, "I will tell you the truth about the Vampire King's queen and why she had to die, why her human blood made her dangerous and her love for Lucian made her a target." Seraph then did something that seemed like carelessness, but was clearly deliberate. She turned her back to check some arcane apparatus, and in doing so left a servant passage door standing unlocked, an escape route that Mira could take if she chose to run rather than face execution. The chief mage gave her the choice explicitly: run now and live as a fugitive forever, or stay and trust that Lucian possessed enough power and will to save her from the council's judgment. Mira stood in that circular room with floating crystals casting shadows across her face and made her decision. If she ran, the prince would lose his only witness to what had been done to him. Whoever planted that curse would remain hidden and free to act again. And so she told Seraph that she would stay because some fights were worth dying for. As guards escorted her back to her cell, walking through corridors filled with afternoon light, Mira passed a window that looked down into the main courtyard, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Workers were constructing a pyre, stacking wood in careful layers and soaking it with oil that would burn hot and fast, and she realized with horrible certainty that her execution was not going to be a quiet affair conducted in darkness, but a public spectacle designed to send a message about what happened to those who touched royal blood without permission. The grand hall filled rapidly as the hour approached 5:30 in the afternoon, nobles in dark velvet and silk taking their places on tiered seats, while lesser court members crowded the back, and servants lined the walls in rigid rows, forced to attend as a living reminder of what happened to those who forgot their station. Sunset would come at 6:47, the execution scheduled for that precise moment when day surrendered to night. But the council had decided that justice required spectacle, and so the trial was moved from private chambers to this vast space where hundreds could witness the machinery of vampire law grinding a human woman to dust. Adrian sat beside his father on the raised dais, dressed in formal regalia that included a silver circlet and a heavy cloak embroidered with the royal seal, but his hands were clenched white-knuckled on the arms of his chair, and his newly restored hearing picked up every whisper that rippled through the assembled crowd. Lucian sat motionless as carved stone, his face revealing nothing, but Adrian had known his father long enough to recognize the tension in his shoulders and the way his fingers drummed once against his throne before going still. The great doors opened, and guards brought Mira in, her wrists and ankles bound with chains that gleamed silver-bright in the witchlight. Silver-plated iron that would burn vampire skin on contact, and served as a symbolic reminder that she was other, human, fundamentally separate from the immortal beings who would judge her. They forced her to kneel in the center of the hall on cold marble that had seen countless trials over the centuries, and Adrian felt something hot and furious rise in his chest at the sight of her brought low before this assembly of predators. Counselor Vex rose from his seat among the five, his black robes whisper soft as he moved to stand before the dais, and his voice carried through the hall with the practiced projection of someone who had delivered judgment many times before. "Mira Ashton," he intoned, "you stand accused of violating Sacred Law 13, which prohibits common-born from touching royal blood without explicit summons or consent. How do you plead to this charge?" Mira lifted her chin and met his gaze without flinching, her voice steady as she declared that she had helped the prince, and that helping someone in pain could never be a crime, and murmurs rippled through the crowd like wind through tall grass. Vex allowed himself a thin smile and launched into rhetoric clearly designed to sway the noble vampires who feared human influence on their ancient bloodlines, explaining that intentions were irrelevant when law existed to protect the sanctity of royal blood, that permitting common-born to lay hands on royalty without consequence invited chaos and the dissolution of the hierarchies that kept their society stable. He played to the faction that had never accepted Queen Isolda's marriage to Lucian, that viewed human blood as contamination rather than fresh vitality, and Adrian watched nobles nodding in agreement as Vex wove his argument. Adrian could not remain silent any longer, and he stood abruptly, his chair scraping against stone, and declared in that rough, unused voice that he had consented to Mira's touch, that she had asked permission in sign language, and he had nodded his agreement. Vex turned to him with an expression of patient condescension and explained that Adrian was a minor in the eyes of the right until his 18th birthday, that his consent was legally invalid, and therefore the violation stood regardless of his wishes. The dismissal was calculated and cruel, reducing Adrian to a child whose opinions could be safely ignored, and he felt his father's hand on his arm in silent warning not to push further. Lucian rose then, and the hall went silent in a way that had nothing to do with Adrian's former deafness, and everything to do with the power that radiated from the vampire king when he chose to wield it. "Counselor Vex," Lucian said in a voice like silk over steel, "you speak eloquently of law, and yet I find no record of anyone investigating how a cursed object came to be placed in my infant son's ear. Shall we discuss that matter before we execute the only person who has shown concern for his well-being?" Vex's expression remained perfectly controlled, but something flickered in his eyes, some calculation being rapidly adjusted, and he replied that the investigation was ongoing, but that it did not absolve the girl's trespass against sacred law. Seraph rose from her seat among the council and moved to the center of the hall carrying the glass vial that held the black crystal seed, her ancient face unreadable as she presented her findings to the assembled court. "The crystal is silencing root," she announced, "banned magic that was outlawed 600 years ago after the Blood Wars. And only a master of blood sorcery could craft such a thing. There are 3 such practitioners alive in the known world," she continued. 2 are dead, and the 3rd sits on this council. The hall erupted into chaos, nobles shouting questions while servants pressed back against the walls in fear, and Isabeau surged to her feet with an expression of outrage. "This is slander," she cried, baseless accusation designed to deflect from the girl's crimes, but Seraph merely regarded her with those ancient eyes. Mordain demanded to know who Seraph was accusing, and the chief mage replied that she would not name anyone without proof, but that she could say with certainty the magic was keyed to the prince's bloodline, that whoever placed it had access to his blood within hours of his birth when such ties were easiest to forge. Lucian saw his opening and seized it with the precision of a predator, declaring that they would table the execution until the investigation concluded, that the girl would remain in custody but alive until they determined who had cursed his son. Vex began to protest, invoking the law's absolute authority, but Lucian's voice dropped to a temperature that could freeze fire. "I am the law," the Vampire King said, and there was no room for argument in those 4 words, no space for the council to maneuver without openly defying him. The council could not challenge him directly without triggering the civil war they had worked so carefully to avoid, and so Vex bowed with stiff formality and conceded the point. "As you command, Majesty," he said, but proposed that the girl be held in the blood vault until they concluded their investigation. For her own protection, he claimed though everyone in the hall understood it was the most escape-proof location in the palace. Lucian considered this and nodded once, accepting the compromise, and guards moved forward to seize Mira and drag her toward the doors. As they hauled her to her feet, chains clinking with each movement, she looked across the hall and locked eyes with Adrian, and he mouthed words he hoped she could read. "I will find a way." Night fell over the palace, and Adrian paced his chambers like a caged wolf, sound crashing over him in waves that he was still learning to process, wind howling around the towers and distant conversations bleeding through walls, and his own pulse thundering in his ears. He could not imagine returning to silence now, could not fathom going back to that muffled world where everything was gesture and guesswork, and the thought that the council planned to let Mira die for giving him this gift made rage burn hot and clean in his chest. A quiet knock preceded Captain Thorne's entrance, the weathered soldier moving with the careful steps of someone who understood he was about to commit treason. "Your Highness," Thorne said, "I served your mother before you were born, and she once told me that if her son ever needed to break a rule to do what was right, she hoped he would have the courage." The captain placed an iron key on Adrian's desk, its metal dark with age, and explained that this opened the blood vault, that there would be a 10-minute window during guard shift change at 2 in the morning, and that after providing this information, he knew nothing more. Adrian stared at the key and understood what was being offered. Freedom for Mira, but also the beginning of open rebellion against the council, and he knew he could not free her without having somewhere for her to go, and some way to protect her from recapture. He needed leverage against the council, proof of who had cursed him that was so undeniable they could not simply bury it beneath more lies and legal maneuvering. After Thorne departed, Adrian raided his father's study while Lucian was occupied in an emergency session with loyalist nobles, searching through centuries of accumulated documents for anything that might help. He found Isolde's letters, read the witch's warnings about silence being used as a weapon, and discovered a locked box hidden behind a false panel in the desk. The lock was simple enough for someone who had spent years learning to occupy himself in solitude, and inside he found a vial of black liquid labeled in his mother's handwriting, "Antidote to silencing root, unfinished." His mother had been trying to save him before she died, had been working on counter-magic even as the council moved against her, and Adrian realized that this vial might be the key to everything if only he could determine what ingredients were missing. He found notes tucked beneath the vial, his mother's careful script explaining that the antidote required blood of the caster combined with willing tears of the cursed, that forcing these 2 elements together would destroy the curse permanently, and in the process reveal the caster's identity to anyone with magical sight. If Adrian could identify who had cursed him and force them to give blood, he could prove their guilt in a way that even the council could not deny or explain away. At 2 in the morning, Adrian descended through forgotten passages to the blood vault, a spherical chamber suspended in a vast cavern by thick chains, its surface covered in runes that glowed with sullen red light. He used Thorne's key, and the door opened with a groan of ancient mechanisms, revealing Mira sitting on a stone bench in the chamber's center. She looked exhausted but unbroken, her eyes sharp as they fixed on him, and she asked why he was there when discovery would mean punishment for them both. "Because you saved me," Adrian said simply, "and I will not let them kill you for it." He explained about the antidote and his mother's unfinished work, and Mira asked the obvious question of whether he knew who the caster was. whether he had proof that would hold up under the council's scrutiny. Adrian admitted he had only theories, that his mother died the same night he went silent, that perhaps she had been poisoned to prevent her from protecting him with the counter-magic she was developing. Mira reached into her clothing and pulled out Celeste's journal, the one Seraph had somehow returned to her during the interrogation, and she showed him the entry that described Counselor Isabeau in the nursery on the night of his mother's death. "Your old maid saw her there," Mira said. "And Isabeau specializes in bloodline magic according to what servants whisper. She would have had the skill and the opportunity." A plan began to crystallize in Adrian's mind, and he shared it with Mira, suggesting they tell the council he had recovered memory of that night, that he could see who had placed the curse, betting that the real caster would panic and move to silence him permanently. Mira understood the risk immediately. If they were wrong about Isabeau, the bluff would fail and Adrian would lose all credibility. But if they were right, the caster would be forced to act, and they could set a trap. "Then we set a trap," she agreed, and they began working out the details as Adrian led her from the blood vault through hidden passages toward the palace catacombs, where she could hide until they sprang their plan. They moved through tunnels carved from living rock, passages that dated back to the palace's founding, and it was while navigating a particularly narrow section that they heard voices echoing from somewhere ahead. Adrian pulled Mira against the stone wall, and they pressed themselves into shadows as two figures came into view. Counselors Vex and Mordain, walking together in quiet conversation that carried clearly in the enclosed space. "The girl is still alive," Mordain was saying, his scarred face twisted with displeasure. "If she talks, or if Seraph finds proof we cannot dismiss, everything unravels." Vex replied with cold certainty that the girl knew nothing useful, but that the prince was the real problem, that Seraph was already suspicious, and if the Vampire King discovered the Pact of Five, their carefully constructed plans would collapse. Mordain asked what they should do, and Vex's answer made Adrian's blood run cold. They would accelerate the timeline, he said. The prince would die before his 18th birthday. Some tragic accident that would devastate Lucian, but leave the council's power intact. Adrian and Mira exchanged horrified looks as the counselor's footsteps faded into the distance, both of them understanding that they had stumbled onto something far larger than a single curse placed 17 years ago. The council was not just hiding one crime, but planning another, and whatever the Pact of Five entailed, it was worth killing for repeatedly. And Adrian realized that his mother's death might have been only the first in a series of murders designed to control the throne through a puppet king who would never reach his majority. The forgotten chapel in the catacombs smelled of dust and centuries of neglect, its walls lined with stone shelves that held books and scrolls in various states of decay, and pale witchlight flickered to life as Adrian and Mira entered the space that had clearly not been disturbed in decades. They had hours until dawn, hours to make sense of what they had overheard. And Adrian was reeling from the revelation that his own council wanted him dead, that the people who had advised his father and shaped policy for generations were planning his murder. Mira recognized the signs of shock setting in, and she made him sit on a fallen column, placing her hands on his shoulders and telling him firmly to breathe, to focus, to channel his fear into something useful. "What is the Pact of Five?" she asked, and Adrian admitted he had never heard of it. That the right of accord was common knowledge, but this shadow agreement Vex and Mordain discussed was entirely unknown to him. They began searching the chapel systematically, pulling books from shelves and blowing dust from covers, looking for anything that might explain what the council was hiding. It was Mira who found the tome, a massive volume bound in black leather and embossed with silver lettering that read, "The Right of Accord" and "The Shadow Pact." And when she opened it carefully, the pages released a smell of old magic and older secrets. The text revealed that 200 years ago, in the aftermath of a succession crisis that nearly destroyed the kingdom, the council signed a secret addendum to the Right of Accord. The clause stated that if the reigning king had no heir who reached majority, defined as 18 years for vampires, whole in body and mind, then the council could invoke regency and rule collectively until a suitable heir emerged. The provision was meant to prevent child kings from being manipulated by ambitious nobles, a safeguard born of bitter experience, but it also created a loophole that the current council had clearly decided to exploit. A deaf prince would not qualify as whole in body, Adrian said slowly, as understanding dawned cold and terrible, which meant that by cursing him, the council ensured he would never be eligible to rule, regardless of his bloodline or training. Mira followed the logic to its brutal conclusion, explaining that Lucian would age slowly over centuries, but would eventually die or choose to step down. And when that happened, the council would invoke the Shadow Pact and take permanent control, ruling collectively without the inconvenience of a monarch who might disagree with their policies. Killing Adrian now, before his 18th birthday, which was only 3 months away, would lock in their power forever because there would be no heir to challenge their regency. Further reading revealed that Counselor Isabeau had authored the Shadow Pact, her signature bold and confident on documents that dated back 2 centuries, and Adrian felt sick as he realized she had been playing this game for longer than his father had been alive. She was ancient even by vampire standards, patient and ruthless, willing to wait decades or centuries for her plans to bear fruit, and she had placed her curse on an infant because she was thinking in terms of generations rather than years. The truly devastating realization came when Adrian understood that his father did not know about the Shadow Pact, that it had been buried in legal minutiae and arcane amendments that even a king might not review unless given reason to suspect treachery. If they could tell Lucian about the pact and provide proof of its existence, he could dismantle it through royal decree, but they needed to survive long enough to deliver that information, and they needed evidence that would stand up under scrutiny. Dawn broke over the palace in shades of red and gold, light streaming through windows that had witnessed centuries of intrigue and violence, and Adrian and Mira returned to the public areas separately to avoid suspicion. She took the servant tunnels she knew so well, moving with the invisible efficiency of someone trained to be overlooked, while he entered through the main doors and claimed to have fallen asleep in the library researching vampire law. He sent word through Captain Thorne that he requested an audience with the full council, a formal session that would require his father's presence, and could not be refused without raising questions about what they were hiding. The grand hall filled again with nobles eager to witness whatever drama was unfolding, and Adrian stood before the assembled council with his heart hammering, but his voice steady as he spoke. "I have remembered something," he announced. "About the night I lost my hearing, I was not alone in the nursery, and I saw a face." He turned to look directly at Isabeau and delivered his accusation. "Counselor Isabeau, you were there. I remember your pendant, the silver moon you always wear. You were holding me." Isabeau's face hardened into something cold and dangerous, but her voice remained smooth as she replied that she had visited many times, that she had been fond of his mother and had often checked on the infant prince. Adrian pushed harder, asking why she was the last person to hold him before he went silent, what business she had in the nursery at that particular hour, and Isabeau's eyes flashed with anger as she asked if he was accusing her. Lucian intervened from his throne, asking his son what he was doing, what game he was playing, but before Adrian could answer, Seraph rose from her seat. The chief mage had been waiting for exactly this moment, and she seized it with the precision of someone who had spent decades positioning pieces on a board invisible to others. "Counselor Isabeau," Seraph said, "would you consent to a blood truth ritual? It will clear your name and end these accusations." Blood truth rituals were ancient magic that could not be refused without appearing guilty, and Isabeau hesitated for just a fraction of a second, a pause so brief most would miss it, but that spoke volumes to those watching carefully. Vex attempted to intervene, calling this theater and suggesting that Adrian was traumatized and confused, that they should adjourn and revisit the matter when emotions were less volatile, but the crowd of nobles murmured with interest because they wanted answers to questions that had lingered for 17 years. Isabeau made her calculation and decided that her magical wards would protect her from the truth magic, that she could pass the ritual because technically she had not placed the curse with her own hands. "I have nothing to hide," she declared with cold confidence, and agreed to submit to the ritual. The Chamber of Truth lay beneath the throne room, a sanctified space used for trials that required magical verification, And Isabeau entered along with Adrian, Seraph, and Lucian, while Mira watched from a hidden alcove that Seraph had quietly indicated to her. Seraph drew a circle on the floor using salt blessed by moonlight, and placed a black mirror in the center, its surface dark as a starless sky, and Isabeau placed her hand on the glass with the confidence of someone certain of victory. Seraph asked the first question clearly and formally. Did you place the silencing root in Prince Adrian's ear 17 years ago? And Isabeau answered no with conviction. The mirror stayed clear and smooth, reflecting nothing, because she was telling the literal truth, and Adrian's heart sank as he realized he had been wrong, had accused the wrong person, and destroyed his credibility. But Seraph was not finished, and she asked a different question with careful precision. Did you hire someone else to place the curse? Did you pay another to do what you designed? Isabeau began to answer, her mouth forming denial, but the mirror cracked with a sound like breaking ice, and she jerked her hand back as if burned. The proof was undeniable and written in shattered glass. She had hired a blood mage to perform the actual curse, the third practitioner that Seraph had mentioned, someone now conveniently dead and unable to testify. She had paid in land and titles, in favors accumulated over centuries. And the curse was her design even if she had kept her own hands technically clean. Lucian moved faster than human eye could follow, crossing the chamber in a blur of speed and slamming Isabeau against the wall hard enough to crack stone, his hand around her throat and his eyes blazing with rage that had been building for 17 years. You cursed my son, he said in a voice that could strip flesh from bone. You stole 17 years from him. You took his hearing and made him suffer. Why would you do this? Isabeau met his gaze without flinching, and her defiance was absolute as she explained that his human whore of a queen was going to destroy them all, that every generation mixed with mortal blood weakened the vampire bloodline, until within 3 generations they would be human themselves, soft and brief and pathetic. I saved our kind, she declared. I protected what we are from your weakness for human warmth. Seraph produced the Shadow Pact document then, the original copy she had found in the archives after decades of searching, and she explained that Isabeau had planned to rule in Adrian's place through the Regency Clause. Lucian read the document with mounting fury, seeing how he had been manipulated, how his council had engineered a situation where his son's disability would justify their permanent seizure of power, and when he looked up, his expression was murderous. Isabeau laughed then, a sound without humor or warmth, and she told him plainly that killing her would break the right of accord, would cause the noble houses to revolt against a king who executed council members without due process, that she was untouchable because he needed the council to maintain order. Lucian stepped back because she was right, because civil war would kill thousands and destroy everything he had built, and Isabeau smiled as if she had won. Adrian stepped forward then, pulling the vial of antidote from his pocket along with a ceremonial dagger he had taken from his mother's effects, and his voice was steady as he explained that the cure required the caster's blood, willingly given or forcibly taken, combined with tears of the cursed. I have already cried, he said, and held up the vial where his tears mixed with the black liquid his mother had prepared. Now I just need your blood. Give it freely, or I will take it. Isabeau realized he was serious, that if the curse was undone using her blood as the catalyst, it would prove her guilt through magic that could not be denied or explained away, and she tried to flee, but Lucian blocked the door with his body. Adrian moved with the speed he had inherited from his father and caught her wrist, drawing the dagger across her palm in a cut that was not deep but was enough to make blood flow freely. He held the vial under the wound, and crimson drops fell into the mixture, turning it from black to white to something that glowed with inner light, and he added more of his own tears, genuine grief for the years he had lost, and the mother he had never known. The antidote glowed brighter as the elements combined, blood and tears, and his mother's dying magic weaving together into something that hummed with power, and Adrian drank it without hesitation. The effect was internal and immediate, warmth spreading through his body as residual curse magic burned away, and Seraph confirmed what he already felt. The magic is gone completely, he is whole, and the cure was made with the caster's blood, which proves beyond any doubt who is responsible. Isabeau collapsed to her knees as the weight of her failure crushed her, 2 centuries of planning destroyed in a single moment, and she was broken not by violence, but by the absolute certainty that she had lost everything. The throne hall was packed to capacity the following day, as nobles and courtiers assembled to witness judgment being passed on those who had conspired against the crown, and the atmosphere was electric with anticipation because this was history being made in real time. Isabeau stood in chains before the dais, stripped of her council robes and her silver moon pendant, reduced to a prisoner awaiting sentence, and Lucian's voice was cold as winter when he declared her title forfeit and her lands seized by the crown. He could not execute her without council approval, a bitter irony given that she had helped craft those very laws, but exile was within his royal prerogative, and he invoked it without hesitation. Isabeau was banished to the border provinces, forbidden from entering the capital or holding any position of authority, and guards would escort her to the edges of the kingdom before dawn. Vex and Mordain stood pale and rigid as Lucian turned his attention to them, their complicity in the conspiracy proven through testimony and evidence that Seraph had carefully assembled. They would retain their positions as advisors, but with no voting power, reduced to consultants whose opinions could be sought or ignored at the king's pleasure, and the humiliation was visible in the way they held themselves. Alara, who had played both sides with characteristic cunning, was permitted to remain on the council, but under close observation, and she accepted this arrangement with a gracious bow that fooled no one about the calculations happening behind her eyes. Seraph was elevated to first counselor, a position that gave her authority to speak for the council as a whole, and she accepted with the same unreadable expression she wore for everything. The moment came then that many had been waiting for, the disposition of the human maid who had started this entire cascade of revelations. And Lucian's voice carried clearly through the hall as he declared Mira Ashton innocent of all charges and awarded her a new title. She would become royal physician's apprentice, a position created specifically for her, with quarters in the East Wing, and a stipend generous enough to make several nobles choke on their wine. The court murmured at this unprecedented honor for a common-born human, but no one dared challenge the vampire king openly, not after what had just been revealed about the council's treachery. Adrian stood then, and the hall fell silent, because most had never heard him speak, had become so accustomed to his silence that his voice still seemed like a miracle or a trick. He addressed the assembled court in that rough, unused voice that was growing stronger each day, telling them that he had been silent for 17 years, and in that silence he had learned to see what others missed, to read truth in gesture and expression. "I will not forget that," he said, "and I will not let anyone, whether council or king, steal another voice from anyone in this kingdom." It was a veiled warning, and everyone heard it. The passive prince who could be safely ignored was gone, and in his place stood someone who would not be controlled or manipulated. That evening, Lucian and Adrian spoke privately in the king's study, the fire crackling and wine untouched on the desk between them, and Lucian said what he had been holding inside since the truth emerged. "I failed you," he told his son. "I should have questioned your deafness from the beginning, should have investigated more thoroughly, should have protected you from those I trusted." Adrian shook his head and replied that his father could not have known, that the conspiracy was too well hidden and too carefully constructed, but that now he needed Lucian to teach him everything because he had 3 months until his birthday, and he needed to be ready to rule. Lucian smiled then for the first time in what felt like years, genuine warmth breaking through the mask of kingship, and he agreed that they would begin the next day. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm as the palace adjusted to its new reality. Mira trained with the royal physicians, learning anatomy and herbalism, studying the properties of plants and minerals, and discovered that her latent magic was real, though limited to healing and protection, rather than the destructive forces that combat mages wielded. Adrian studied statecraft and law with his father, learning the delicate balance of power that kept the kingdom stable, and he trained in combat with weapons masters who had served the crown for centuries. They saw each other in passing, shared meals in the common dining hall, brief conversations in the library when their schedules aligned, and slowly a connection deepened between them that went beyond gratitude or shared trauma. Both were outsiders in their own ways. She was common-born in a court that valued bloodline above all else, while he had been isolated by deafness that made him seem broken to those who valued strength. Both valued truth over politics, preferred direct questions to elaborate games, and they began to rely on each other in ways that felt natural and inevitable. Adrian asked her opinion on disputes between nobles, trusting her to see through pretense to underlying motivations, and she taught him to read body language with the precision she had developed as a servant who survived by noticing what powerful people wanted before they asked. The romantic tension built slowly like water behind a dam, small moments that accumulated weight over time. Mira adjusted his collar before a council meeting, and their hands touched, the contact lasting a heartbeat longer than necessary, and Adrian found himself listening for her heartbeat in crowded rooms, discovering he could distinguish its rhythm from all others. She caught him watching her while she worked and felt heat rise in her cheeks, turned away to hide the smile she could not quite suppress, and the court noticed everything. Gossip spread like fire through dry grass, a human maid and the crown prince. How scandalous. How inappropriate. How doomed to end in tragedy. Elara planted rumors with surgical precision, suggesting that Mira was a witch who had seduced the prince with magic, that her healing abilities were actually dark sorcery designed to control him. Lucian warned his son to be careful, explained that the court would use Mira against him, would turn their connection into a weapon to undermine his authority. But Adrian met his father's eyes and said simply that they could try. 2 months passed in study and training, and the slow building of something neither Adrian nor Mira had words for yet, and the kingdom prepared for the crown prince's 18th birthday with celebrations planned across every province. His coronation as official heir would make him legally eligible to rule, would close the loophole the council had tried to exploit, and security was tight because everyone remembered how close they had come to disaster. Seraph brought troubling news 3 weeks before the celebration, arriving at Lucian's study with an expression that made both king and prince tense immediately. Isabeau had vanished from her exile in the border provinces, the chief mage reported. She was last seen entering the Wraithwood, a cursed forest where even vampires feared to tread because old magic saturated the ground and ancient entities still walked beneath twisted trees. Reports were coming in from villages near the forest, strange lights visible at night between the branches, voices calling names of people who had died years ago, and one farmer's son had gone missing for 3 days before returning home silent and unresponsive. Seraph had examined the boy and found a black crystal seed lodged in his ear, identical to the one that had cursed Adrian, which meant Isabeau was making more, and whatever she planned was not finished. The chief mage's warning was grave, explaining that Isabeau might be seeking allies among the things that dwelled in the Wraithwood, entities that predated vampires and humans both, old gods who had been banished or forgotten, but never truly destroyed. If she bargains with them, Seraph said, and let the sentence trail off because they all understood what that incomplete thought implied. Adrian made his decision immediately, announcing that they would stop her before she finished whatever dark work she had begun, but Lucian forbade it with the absolute authority of a king and father combined. "You are not ready," Lucian said. "You have trained for weeks, not years, and the Wraithwood is death for the unprepared." Adrian met his father's gaze and replied that he would never be ready if he was never tested, that 3 months from now he would be expected to rule, and he could not do that if he spent his life being protected from danger. Mira spoke up then, her voice steady despite the fear she felt, announcing that she would go with Adrian into the Wraithwood. Both Lucian and Adrian refused instantly, but Mira pressed her argument, pointing out that she was the only one present who was not a vampire, and if Isabeau was using anti-vampire magic, they would need someone who could counter it. Lucian looked at his son and saw the determination there, recognized that sometimes the only way to forge a ruler was to let him face the fire, and he agreed reluctantly on condition that Captain Thorne and a full company of elite guards accompany them. The journey to the border took 2 days of hard riding, and the Wraithwood loomed on the horizon long before they reached it, a dark stain against the landscape where trees grew twisted and wrong. The sky above the forest was perpetually gray, as if sunlight could not quite penetrate whatever curse hung over those woods, and when they reached the edge, the silence was absolute. No birds singing, no wind rustling leaves, just oppressive quiet that pressed against the ears. They found the farmer's son in the first village, still catatonic despite his family's desperate attempts to wake him, and Mira examined him with careful hands and confirmed what Seraph had reported. A black crystal seed identical to Adrian's original curse was lodged deep in his ear canal, proof that Isabeau had not given up her plans but was instead accelerating them. They followed signs deeper into the Wraithwood, scorched earth where spellwork had burned through natural growth, dead animals arranged in patterns that spoke of ritual magic, spent components that Mira recognized from her studies. The guards grew increasingly uneasy as they penetrated further into cursed territory, and one swore he saw his dead mother standing between the trees, while another heard his name called in a voice he recognized. Captain Thorne ordered those affected restrained before they could wander off, and the company pressed forward with weapons drawn and nerves stretched to breaking. They reached a clearing where an ancient stone altar stood covered in runes that predated any written language the scholars knew, and Isabeau stood before it, chanting in words that hurt to hear. Beside her stood a figure made of shadow and smoke wearing a crown woven from thorns, and Adrian recognized it from old stories his tutors had told. A Wraith Lord, one of the old gods that had ruled before vampires or humans walked the earth. Isabeau was offering a bargain, her voice rising in ritual cadence as she promised the Wraith Lord power to silence the entire kingdom in exchange for 1,000 voices, 1,000 souls to feed its eternal hunger. The entity was considering, its form flickering between solid and insubstantial as it weighed the offer. Adrian stepped into the clearing, and his voice rang out clear and commanding, ordering Isabeau to stop this madness, and she turned without surprise, as if she had been expecting him. She asked if he had come to watch her finish what she started, and Adrian offered her mercy one final time, promised that his father would grant her a fair trial if she surrendered peacefully. Isabeau laughed, and the sound was edged with madness, declaring that mercy was for the weak, and she was about to become a god. The Wraith Lord attacked with speed that defied physics, moving through the guards like smoke, and where it touched them, their voices were ripped away, soldiers collapsing and choking in sudden silence. Captain Thorne engaged Isabeau directly, and discovered she had been augmented by dark magic, moving faster and striking harder than any vampire he had faced. Adrian fought his way toward Isabeau with determination born of desperation, but she was centuries old, and he had trained for weeks, and the mismatch showed immediately as she overpowered him and slammed him against the altar. She should have killed him as an infant, she said, as she raised the same ceremonial dagger he had used to cut her palm during the truth ritual. Poetic justice that would end with his blood soaking into ancient stone. Mira threw a vial she had prepared specifically for this possibility, an alchemical mixture that exploded in brilliant light, and Isabeau, with her vampire sensitivity to sudden stimuli, recoiled instinctively. Mira dragged Adrian free while Isabeau was disoriented, and he saw the altar clearly for the first time, recognized that the Wraith Lord was bound to it through the rune work that covered its surface. He shouted for Mira to destroy the altar, and she pulled Captain Thorne's hammer from where it hung at his belt, brought it down on the central rune with all her strength, and the stone cracked with a sound like breaking worlds. The altar shattered and the Wraith Lord was freed from its ancient prison. But because Isabeau had invoked it, the entity was now bound to her through the laws of ritual magic. It turned on her with something that might have been hunger or amusement, announcing that she had freed it, and now it would take her voice as payment for centuries of imprisonment. Isabeau screamed as the Wraith Lord drained her, the sound cutting off abruptly as silence claimed her, and she collapsed to the ground. The entity turned its attention to the others then, freed from its binding and hungry for the voices it had been promised, but Mira's latent magic flared without conscious direction. Raw emotion translated into power, and she cast a ward she had never learned, pure instinct creating a barrier of light that made the Wraithlord hiss in displeasure. "We will meet again, Magling," it whispered before retreating into the depths of the Wraithwood, and the promise in those words was unmistakable. They returned to the palace with Isabeau alive but permanently mute, irony so perfect it felt like fate rather than chance, and she was imprisoned for life in cells deep beneath the throne. The guards who had lost their voices were treated by every physician and mage the kingdom could summon, and Mira's training accelerated as Seraph worked to find a cure for curse-induced silence. On Adrian's 18th birthday, the palace blazed with celebration, every hall filled with music and light, and he was crowned crown prince in a ceremony attended by nobles from every province. He wore his mother's sigil alongside his father's, silver moon and golden sun intertwined, and in his speech to the assembled court, he spoke of being born into silence and learning the world in a different way. "Now I have a voice," he said, "and I will use it for those who have none," and the promise resonated through the hall. Lucian officially named Mira as court mage in training, apprentice to Seraph and heir to her position eventually, and the nobility was scandalized, but no one dared object when the vampire king's word was absolute law. After the ceremony ended, and nobles drifted toward feasts and entertainments, Adrian and Mira met in the palace garden, where Isolde had once walked with Lucian before tragedy claimed her. Adrian told Mira that he had never thanked her properly, that words felt inadequate for what she had given him, and she began to protest that he owed her nothing. He took her hand then, the gesture formal but charged with meaning that made her breath catch, and told her that she had given him the world, that he had heard his first sound because of her courage, and that now he heard his heartbeat quickest when she was near. He kissed her hand, and she was breathless as she stammered his title, but he corrected her gently. "Just Adrian," he said, "not your highness or crown prince, simply the name his mother had chosen." They walked together through the garden as evening fell and a raven landed on the stone wall, watching them with eyes too intelligent for a simple bird. In its beak it carried a black feather identical to those that formed the Wraithlord's substance, and it dropped the feather deliberately before flying toward the distant Wraithwood. The feather drifted down to land on white gravel, and somewhere in the cursed forest, a voice whispered words that carried on wind that should not exist. "The prince has a protector now," it said, "but can she protect him from what is coming?" And the question hung unanswered as darkness gathered beneath twisted trees. The palace had found a rhythm in the 6 months since Adrian's coronation as crown prince, the kingdom stabilizing under the careful guidance of new counselors chosen by merit rather than bloodline, a radical shift that sent ripples through noble society. Adrian shadowed his father in governance, sitting through diplomatic negotiations and tax disputes and border conflicts, learning the delicate balance required to rule a nation of immortals who remembered grudges for centuries. His voice was strong now, confident in a way that made people forget he had ever been silent, but he still used sign language with the deaf servants he had hired on his own initiative, creating positions throughout the palace for those who would have been excluded under the old system. Mira's progress as court mage in training had accelerated under Seraph's demanding tutelage, and she had discovered through careful genealogical research that her great-grandmother had been a hedge witch, exiled from a northern coven for refusing to participate in blood rituals. Her powers were growing steadily, minor healing that could close wounds and ease pain, wards that protected against hostile magic, empathic sensing that let her read the emotional states of those around her, though this last ability sometimes overwhelmed her in crowded spaces. She remained awkward with formal court life, uncomfortable in the elaborate gowns that protocol required, and uncertain how to navigate conversations laden with double meanings. But she had earned genuine respect through competence and the willingness to speak uncomfortable truths. The relationship between Adrian and Mira was the worst-kept secret in the palace. They were not officially courting, because that would cause the court to implode in scandalized outrage. but everyone knew from the way they gravitated toward each other in any room, and the way Adrian's attention never strayed far from wherever she stood. Lucian privately approved, because Mira reminded him of Isolde in her directness, and her refusal to let power corrupt her compassion, and he had begun to quietly investigate what legal mechanisms might permit a human to marry into the royal bloodline. Seraph brought troubling news one morning as she found Mira in the library, surrounded by texts on protective magic, the chief mage's expression grave as she explained that her studies of the Wraithwood incident had revealed something disturbing. The Wraith Lord had called Mira Magaling, a term used exclusively for mages chosen by ancient entities as vessels or champions, and Seraph believed the creature had marked her during their confrontation. "It marked you," the chief mage said, "and it will return because old gods do not destroy what interests them, but instead seek to corrupt and claim." Mira felt fear coil in her stomach as she asked what the entity wanted from her, and Seraph's answer was blunt. "It will come with an offer that seems reasonable or even generous, but the price will be your soul or your will. Do not listen no matter how tempting the bargain sounds." Adrian made his vow immediately when he learned of this threat, declaring that they would face whatever came together, but Mira tried to protest that this was her burden and he did not have to share it. His response was simple and absolute: "Yes, I do, because you gave me my voice, and I am not letting anyone take yours." A stranger arrived at the palace gates 3 weeks later. A messenger from the northern covens, bearing documents sealed with ice that never melted. And the message was an invitation specifically for Mira. The Confederation of Witches had heard of her growing power, and they offered training at the Frostspire, 3 months of intensive study that would teach her to control magic that was currently wild and unpredictable. The dilemma was immediate and painful, because accepting meant separating from Adrian for the first extended period since they had met, but refusing meant remaining vulnerable to the Wraith Lord when it inevitably returned. Adrian made the decision easier by telling her to go, to learn everything she could, and promising that he would still be there when she returned because 3 months was nothing compared to the lifetime they were building. She left at dawn with a pack of supplies and the white staff the Frostspire had sent as a token of safe passage, and Adrian watched from the battlements as she rode through gates that seemed impossibly far away. She looked back once and their eyes met across the distance, and he touched his chest over his heart, while she mirrored the gesture, a promise without words that needed no translation. After Mira's departure, Adrian threw himself into governance with renewed intensity. But 2 weeks later, he confronted his father in the private study, where Lucian reviewed reports from across the kingdom. "You knew," Adrian said without preamble, "about the curse, and about the council's conspiracy. You suspected even if you could not prove it." Lucian was silent for a long moment, before admitting with bone-deep weariness that yes, he had suspected, but moving against the council without proof would have triggered civil war and destroyed everything he had built. "I failed you as a father," Lucian said, "by choosing the kingdom over your well-being, and the confession cost him visibly." Adrian's response was measured and surprisingly gentle as he pointed out that his father was still choosing the kingdom, and so was he, that this was what it meant to be king, to carry the weight of decisions that had no good options. "You will be a better king than me," Lucian said. But Adrian shook his head and replied that he would try to be different, that this was all he could promise. They spent the following weeks hunting together in the forests that bordered the capital, a royal tradition Adrian had missed during his silent years, and Lucian taught him the Dracorian histories, stories of kings who ruled wisely and those who fell to corruption through pride or fear. Adrian listened with the gift of hearing he had never expected to possess, finally able to hear his father's voice share the accumulated wisdom of 800 years. Meanwhile, at the Frostspire, Mira arrived to find a tower of ice that rose impossibly high into perpetual winter, its walls carved with runes that shifted when viewed directly. The witches who inhabited this place were cold and efficient, viewing emotion as weakness and magic as a tool to be mastered through discipline and sacrifice. Her mentor was Morgana, a woman so ancient her age could not be calculated, severe in manner, but possessing knowledge that made Seraph seem young. The training was grueling beyond anything Mira had experienced. Lessons that pushed her empathy into shields strong enough to deflect killing curses. Exercises that taught her to sense lies in heartbeat and breath. Techniques for healing wounds that conventional medicine considered fatal. But Morgana also delivered warnings that made Mira's blood run cold, explaining that power always demanded sacrifice, and that the Wraith Lord would eventually offer something precious in exchange for something she could not afford to lose. When that day comes, Morgana said, remember that no bargain with the old gods is ever equal. They deal in currencies that cannot be repaid. Mira and Adrian exchanged letters carried by enchanted ravens that flew impossibly fast between the Frostspire and the capital, and his letters were carefully formal in portions that others might read, but tender in sections written in code they had developed together. Her letters were filled with small details about frost patterns on windows and northern lights that painted the sky in colors she had never seen. And she confessed with embarrassment that she missed the sound of his heartbeat, which she could still hear in memory with perfect clarity. Back in the kingdom, strange incidents began occurring with increasing frequency, nobles waking to find themselves voiceless, with no curse crystals or visible magical residue, and panic spread through the capital as the number of afflicted grew. Seraph investigated exhaustively and delivered her conclusion with visible concern. This was not a conventional curse, but rather a summons. The Wraith Lord was calling something or someone to the capital, and the silence was merely a side effect. Adrian had a nightmare that felt more real than dreams should, standing in the throne room while the Wraith Lord manifested as a towering figure of shadow and ancient malice. Your mageling is strong, the entity said, but she is mine. I planted my mark in her the day she touched my altar, and when I call she will come, and you, little prince, will have to choose between your kingdom and her soul. He woke shaking and immediately wrote to Mira telling her not to return yet, that it was not safe, but the raven came back singed and unable to speak, and reports from the borders indicated the Wraithwood was expanding, cutting off northern communication routes. At the Frostspire, Mira collapsed during a particularly intense lesson on ward construction. Her consciousness suddenly flooded with the Wraith Lord's voice calling her home. Come back, Mageling, it whispered. The prince needs you, and his kingdom is falling silent. And she saw visions of Adrian fighting shadows and losing, saw the capital drowning in unnatural quiet. Morgana warned that this was obviously a trap, that going to Adrian would play directly into the entity's plans, but Mira asked what choice she had if staying meant Adrian's death. Then you have already made your choice, Morgana said with something that might have been approval, and she handed Mira a staff of white wood carved with runes of severance, an artifact that could break dark bonds, but only once. One use, the ancient witch said, make it count. Mira rode south alone through blizzards and terrain that actively resisted passage, a journey that should have taken weeks, compressed into 14 days of relentless travel. She arrived at the capital to find it transformed, the entire city wrapped in unnatural silence with people moving like ghosts unable to speak or cry out, and only the palace remained untouched as if waiting for her arrival. In the throne room, Adrian faced the Wraith Lord fully manifested, a towering figure of shadow and bone wearing a crown woven from black thorns that seemed to drink light. Release my people, Adrian demanded, with all the authority he could muster. But the Wraith Lord's response was mocking and cruel. They are not yours, it said. They are mine. I gave them voices through the gift of existence, and I take them back. But I offer a trade, the mageling service for 10 years, and I return every voice I have claimed. Mira entered through the great doors, and her voice rang clear as she announced she was already here, and Adrian spun toward her crying out for her to run, to leave, but the Wraith Lord smiled in the way shadows smile. Excellent, it said. The deal stands. 10 years of service. But Mira interrupted with a question that made the entity pause. I will serve you, she said. But first answer why me? Why go to such lengths for one hedge witch's descendant? The revelation came then as the Wraith Lord explained that her bloodline had stolen something from it 8 generations ago, a name of power that was written into her very soul, and it had waited through 8 generations to reclaim what was lost. "Serve me and I take the name peacefully," it said. "Refuse, and I take this kingdom and everyone in it." Mira's gambit was desperate, and based on incomplete understanding, she raised the white staff Morgana had given her and told the entity to take the name immediately, right now, and when it lunged forward with greedy hunger, she drove the staff into her own chest. Light exploded outward in a wave that scoured shadow, the staff not killing her, but severing the mark the Wraith Lord had placed, and simultaneously releasing the stolen name from where it had been hidden in her soul for generations. The name manifested as a word of pure light, a sound that was also a concept that burned the Wraith Lord like acid on shadow, and the entity shrieked in pain and rage as it dissolved, banished back to the Wraithwood weakened but not destroyed. The voices returned to the city in a rush like a dam breaking, people gasping and crying and laughing as speech came back, but Mira collapsed and Adrian caught her before she hit marble. "Stay with me," he begged, and she was alive, but something fundamental had changed. She could not feel the magic anymore. The constant hum of power that had become part of her awareness was simply gone. "I burned it out," she whispered. "The staff took the mark, and the name, but it took my magic too. I cannot feel it anymore." Adrian's response was fierce and immediate. "I do not care. You are alive and that is all that matters." But Mira wept not for the magic itself, but because she feared being useless to him and to the kingdom. The weeks that followed were difficult as Mira recovered physically, but struggled with the loss of an ability she had only begun to understand and master. And the court whispered that she was no longer valuable now that her magic was gone. Adrian was furious on her behalf, but respected her need for space to process the change, and it was Lucian who finally broke through her despair. He spoke to her privately in the garden where Isolde had once walked, telling her that his wife had been human when they met with no magic at all. But she had changed the kingdom more than any mage through compassion and courage and the will to stand when others fell. "You have all 3, Lucian said, and magic or not, you are precisely what this kingdom needs." Mira began working with the deaf servants Adrian had hired, teaching sign language and advocating for accessibility reforms throughout the palace, and she found purpose beyond magic in this work. Adrian joined her efforts enthusiastically, and together they drafted the Silent Rights Act, comprehensive laws protecting those without voices, whether literal or political, and the project gave them both direction. 1 year after Adrian's coronation as crown prince, Lucian made the announcement that shocked the kingdom. He was stepping down not from death or incapacity, but from choice, wanting to see his son rule while he could still guide and advise. Adrian was crowned king in a ceremony that drew nobles from every province, and Mira was named royal advocate, a new title that made her advisor to the throne on matters of equality and justice. In his coronation speech, Adrian addressed the assembled kingdom with words he had spent weeks crafting, explaining that he had been born in silence and learned that power and voice were not the same thing. "Today, I vow to be a king who listens," he said, "not just to nobles, but to every person in this realm, and I will not rule alone." He extended his hand to Mira and she took it, their fingers intertwining before hundreds of witnesses. The court expected him to announce a political marriage to some vampire noble who would cement alliances and produce heirs, but instead Adrian said words that made the hall erupt in chaos. "The laws of this kingdom say a human cannot sit on the throne," he declared. "I propose we change that law." Lucian stood beside Seraph and nodded firmly, seconding the motion, and the vote was set for 6 months hence, with the understanding that if it passed, Adrian could marry Mira and she could be queen, but if it failed, they would face an impossible choice between love and duty. That evening, Adrian and Mira stood on the palace balcony overlooking the city as the sun set in shades of gold and crimson, and he could tolerate the light now, his pure vampire blood making him stronger than most of his kind. "What if they say no?" Mira asked quietly. "What if the nobles will not accept me as queen?" "Then we fight," Adrian replied. "We have done it before, and he touched his ear where the crystal had once been lodged. You gave me my voice, and I will spend the rest of my life giving others theirs, starting with you. Mira smiled and said she did not need magic to be heard anymore because she had him, and his response was simple, and I have you, that is more than enough. They kissed as the sun disappeared below the horizon, symbolic of the merging of their worlds, vampire and human, night and day, silence and sound, and the view pulled back to show the city alive with light and the sound of people living their lives. In the distance, the Wraithwood stirred with malevolent patience, a reminder that threats remained, and the Wraithlord, though weakened, was not destroyed. But for this moment there was hope and the promise of a future they would build together against whatever darkness came.